We begin this episode by acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where we gather to record and share these stories. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and recognise the deep cultural knowledge, connection and care that have guided this country across generations. We also extend that respect to any First Nations peoples listening or watching today's episode. As we journey beyond the veil, we do so with gratitude and respect, mindful of the footsteps that came before us and the stories held in this country. May we listen deeply, learn with humility, and move forward with integrity and heart. Welcome to Beyond the Veil Australia podcast, a space where stories, experiences, and the unexplained meet in ways that stay with us long after the moment has passed. I'm Heather, your guide through the shadows and the host of Beyond the Veil Australia podcast. Together, we'll explore the cases that stay with us, the ones with layers beneath the surface, threads waiting to be followed, and voices that deserve the time and attention to be understood. As this season unfolds, more voices join the journey, co-hosts and guests who carry their own pieces of the story through conversation, reflection, and careful attention to detail. We'll follow each case where it leads, uncovering the threads that shift our understanding of the unknown. These aren't just encounters, they're experiences that stay with us. And as we move through each story, we're paying attention to the shifts, the echoes, and the quiet truths that only come forward when you're willing to sit with them long enough. In Season 1, we lifted the veil. In Season 2, we stepped through. And this season, we descend. And now, the descent is open. So follow it where it leads, because the way forward runs down. Hello and welcome to Beyond the Veil Australia podcast with me, your host, Heather. And in this episode, I'm joined by the wonderful Mark from Strewth Podcast, who is a fellow podcaster, a mate, and someone who shares the same deep fascination with the strange edges of our skies. And together, we're stepping into this episode with some of the most compelling aviation mysteries that have ever been recorded. Because there are places in the sky where the world feels thinner, where the horizon softens, the air tightens, and something ancient seems to stir just beyond the edge of human perception. Pilots feel these places, not as a superstition, but as an instinct, a quiet shift in the atmosphere that says, pay attention. And in this episode, we're opening the door to the cases that live in those thresholds, the ones that refuse to settle, the ones that echo across decades, and the ones that pilots still whisper about. Some of these stories you'll know, and some of them you might not. And some will surface organically as we follow through the threads that connect them. We're exploring the disappearances, the strange lights, the instrument failures, the pacing behaviours, the encounters that leave trained minds questioning the very structure of the sky. And as we move through these stories, others may rise to meet us. Cases that link, mirror, or amplify the patterns that we keep seeing. Mark and I are both going to co-host this episode because these mysteries deserve more than just a single voice. They deserve a really deep conversation. They deserve curiosity. And they deserve two podcasters who have spent lots of time immersed in this phenomenon, comparing notes, sharing theories, and following the patterns that keep repeating across time and geography. This isn't just an episode about UAPs. It's about the pilots who met them, the ones who returned, the ones who didn't, and the ones who came back changed. So settle in. We're heading into the upper world where the sky watches back. So Mark, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm really, really pumped that we can have a really deep dive chat into this phenomena, because I know that on your podcast you have definitely covered a couple of cases that I've found really fascinating, and I'm really keen to kind of dive into these particular cases and some more with you, and kind of compare notes and explore it even further. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Heather. Look, it's an absolute privilege to be here. I'm a long-time fan of your show, and you're right. Talking about this subject, I think, you used the line refuses to settle, and I think that's what this is all about. There's so many elements to these cases that just don't make sense. However, rationally we try to look at them, there are, pieces of evidence and, people's interpretations of what's happened to them that you just there's really no clear explanation as to what's going on. So certainly does keep me curious, and looking forward to delving into a couple of these cases and seeing if we can find some of those linkages as well, which is always cool.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, definitely. And I have to say, I've definitely been a listener of yours as well, which is why I was kind of like, oh my God, let's jump into some of these really curious cases, because most people may not know this, but yes, I'm a paranormal enthusiast, but I don't mind a good mystery and a good true crime case as well, which I know Strewth covers really, really well. And you've hit a few cases that I've never heard of, and some that I have, and I've always thoroughly enjoyed them, on top of the mysterious paranormal stuff as well. So I think we're going to have a really good chat today with some of these cases. And yeah, I'm pumped to jump into it too. So
Cool.
a couple of the cases that we'd put together, that I think we both definitely have had some fascination with, was around the disappearance of Frederick Valentich, the Kaikoura encounters in New Zealand, and interestingly, there's a case that sort of feels semi-linked to these that I came across, which was Flight 19, the military flight that disappeared off the coast of Florida in 1945, I think it was, from memory, right. Or 47 something. It was in the World War II times. So, there's some curiosity in a couple of those cases together. So I'm kind of keen to hear what you think on that, and if there's any other cases that you've come across that fit that description too.
Yeah, look, I think the thing that makes those cases so fascinating is it's not just one person out on a lonely road at night seeing something weird in the sky. I mean, you can never discount those type of accounts, and people see things and, that they can't explain, but really you can never be 100% sure what's going on in their mind at the time or exactly what they're seeing. It's always their interpretation of their events. And while those cases are fascinating and certainly worth exploring, and I always give people the benefit of the doubt until they sort of prove themselves to be, trying to tell stories to get famous or make some money or whatever the case might be. I think the ones that I'm always drawn to and come back to are the ones like Frederick Valentich and Kaikoura and Flight 19, when there are multiple people reporting, connective bits of evidence at the same time, that can't be explained in any rational scientific way. So, we're talking about Frederick Valentich being in the sky and then people in the radio room hearing him at the time, seeing him on radar, and going through all of those events with him. And then, of course, Kaikoura that we'll get to as well. There's people on the ground and in the sky and on multiple occasions. So that's what I think sets some of these cases apart, is the multitude of different pieces of evidence that corroborate one another, that really make you stand back and go, hang on a second, this isn't just, some crackpot, out on the back roads that might have been perhaps smoking or doing something that they weren't supposed to earlier that afternoon. This is, there's something going on here that deserves a bit of exploration. So, yeah, that's what makes these ones particularly fascinating to me.
Yeah, absolutely, and I do agree, and I think particularly in your episodes with Frederick Valentich as well, I think one thing that I found really fascinating was that you did go there in the evidence that was captured by these multiple witnesses, and the radio transcripts and things like that. But what I also found really fascinating in that was some of the, I suppose, if we want to call them rational or logical explanations as to what happened to Frederick, also made me kind of stop and think and go, well, yeah, I mean, there is credence to that, but there's still this element of, but how does this happen? And I know that there was a particular reference to, you know, had he been disorientated and potentially rolled his aircraft and was seeing his own reflection, and you know, was he experiencing, you know, maybe like a lack of oxygen because he was disorientated and had what do they call it, hypoxia, I think it is.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, like was something actually happening, which, you know, if we want to sit back on the real logical, skeptical point of view, yes, very well could have been. But I also find it, for somebody who took a long time to be able to get into being a pilot, I just can't imagine that that's entire, that particular explanation can be the only one. I feel like there's got to be more layers to it. And I just don't think, even though he may have been a slight cowboy at times, I don't think he would have been silly enough to fly upside down, if that makes sense.
And I think even from it, like,
yeah,
if we take that sort of potential solution to the problem,
yeah,
if and I'm not a pilot, right, by any stretch, and I've certainly never been upside down in a plane, but I can imagine that if you were,
me either,
and you were seeing your reflection, absolutely that could happen, right? And you could get disoriented, and you could enter the spiral, and you could slam into Bass Strait. But I don't think what you could do from the time that you turned upside down was to have a calm and rational conversation for 8 minutes with someone at a radio station in Melbourne before
especially if
you
you're
hit the water.
hypoxic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think either you're, you know, the person at the other end in that control tower is going to pick up on the fact that you are completely disoriented, and the sheer time that it would take your plane to plummet into the water would be significantly less than 8 minutes. So I think that one in particular, if it was one quick recording, then I think we could, you know, and you know, he was a relatively inexperienced pilot at the time, and that could certainly happen. But the time frame just doesn't make sense to me for that one. Yeah,
absolutely agreed. And I think that's what I found really fascinating about when you did explore that in your episodes, was that you went there and kind of went, well, this is one of the explanations. And it is, I think it's a really crucial thing about that time. You know, I mean, I watch a lot of air crash investigations. I'm not sure about you, but, you know, we look at, you know, some of the cases, even in something like that particular type of show, and the amount of time that it would take an uncontrolled aircraft to plummet and obliterate is, like you said, significantly less. It would be mere seconds versus somebody that's at least trying to ease or control that particular spiral or whatever that is. Like, you would have more time of trying to control something versus uncontrolled and just bang, slamming. You know, it's a very big difference. And I think you're right too. I don't think somebody that's just hanging upside down in their plane can have an 8-minute conversation with, you know, air traffic control in a calm manner. I think you would, it just wouldn't happen. So it is interesting in that sense. And you do, on the recording, which I know I've heard quite a few times, but you do hear this metallic sound. And even though it's a very old recording, metallic sounds are not easy to replicate by any means. And so even if it is old audio, it's still enough for you to identify that is metallic, that whatever that is metallic of some description. It's quite fascinating. And I can't help but think, you know, he had even said, I think, was it to his partner, fiance, that if something happened to him, it would be, it would be something like he'd sort of foreseen that if something happened to him in the air, it would be because he had been taken or abducted or something along those lines. So I even find that fascinating, that it's like, well, why would you say something like that? And then if you know, as an inexperienced pilot or somebody that it took a long time for him to to move through the ranks to get a license. You know, it seems strange to say something like that. Like if I was to go on a flight and be like, oh, if I don't come back, I wouldn't say I'm going to be abducted. I'd be like, if I don't come back, the shit has hit the fan on the plane and we're probably plummeted into the ocean somewhere, you know, like,
yeah.
So I find that interesting too.
The other, you're absolutely right. I think the other thing that I found out a bit more, because I mean, I'd heard about the Frederick Valentich case. It's one of those famous cases in Australian history. And for those who are listening who have never heard about it at all, essentially it was a young man. He was 21 years old, a relatively new pilot. He took off from Moorabbin Airport one night, supposedly going to King Island. The interesting thing that I learnt about this case was that he hadn't actually arranged to land on King Island. And King Island is, you know, in the middle of Bass Strait between Victoria and Tasmania. And at the time, it didn't have 24-hour lights on the runway. You had to actually organise for someone to get out of bed at King Island and come and turn the runway lights on. And he'd not done that, which I think there's lots of really weird, tiny bits of information about this case, and some of them seem like they're really relevant, but they could absolutely be red herrings as well. But the fact that he told one group of people that he'd gone to pick up some tourists, he told another group of people he'd gone there to pick up crayfish, like that, his story in and of itself was quite strange about why he was out that night, which just could be, I mean, the other thing his girlfriend said about that later is that she was pretty confident that the reason that he sort of basically made up these stories is he was looking for excuses to clock up hours, because he was trying to go from being a normal pilot license to a commercial pilot license or something like that. He had to get a certain amount of hours. And she just said, look, it sounds to me as though he was just trying to, you know, look for an excuse to go for a flight. There was never really any intention to land at King Island. But between Moorabbin and King Island, he started making a series of really strange radio calls back to Melbourne about lights that initially started to hover him above, and then they were sort of playing, you know, what he sort of perceived as a game with him, going from one side to the other at extraordinary speeds, underneath him to one side to the other, and then disappearing for periods of time. So it was a strange succession over a couple of minutes of different radio calls that he'd sent into Melbourne. And they got increasingly, at first, quite calm, quite measured. He was more confused than anything else. But the fear in his voice and in what he was saying increased to the point, as you mentioned, the metallic sound at the end after his last radio signal, and no confirmed part of Frederick Valentich's plane. There's a bit of argy-bargy about one particular bit of his plane, but no part was found, certainly in the next couple of days when there was a huge search, and no sign of Frederick Valentich either. So, and that in and of itself, from a UFO case, there's not too many cases of UFOs around the world where we connect it to a UFO sighting and that the person has vanished for good. That's a real rarity, and one of the things that makes it stand out. So, you know, not just from an Australian perspective, but from a world perspective, the fact that he was never seen again, makes it stand out even more.
That's right, and I believe it was just before the metallic sound that those last words of "it's not an aircraft" is enough to give you the chills to be like,
absolutely.
Well, what the fuck is it? Like, what is it, bro? You need to tell us. And you know, there's that part of me that would sit there and go, you know, we're all sitting there going, well, what is it? And then that metallic sound, it's almost like a horror movie in that sense, that it's like, well, maybe that was their message to go, it's us. You know, in a really sort of strange psychological way. But yeah, like it is, and to have no wreckage, like there's nothing, you know.
No, oil slicks, nothing.
And it's nothing, that's right. And even, you know, we could probably I liken it to MH370
Mhm.
in the fact that it's like, where's it gone? There's nothing of it. I do know in recent years, I think some debris had washed up in a completely different part of the
Yeah.
world, and I think they were able to somehow prove that they were part of
Yeah.
MH370. But, you know, we've had nothing from Frederick
Yeah.
Valentich's plane, nothing. Not even a tiny little switch from anything, you know? So
That's right.
it really does kind of beg that question of like, well, where the hell did he go? And I can't remember particularly what this case was, but there's been reports in different parts of the world, but I think potentially around Bass Strait as well with, I don't know if you'd want to call them a wormhole, but like a time lapse or something like that, but they've reappeared at the other end. So it's like, well, maybe it's not, he hasn't gone into a hole and come out the other side in 50 years later, you know. It's like, it's strange.
It certainly has a history. Yeah. I mean, the Bass Strait Triangle as a concept's been thrown up, lots of ships over the years and lots of shipwrecks and that sort of thing, and pilots seeing strange things in the sky. I literally live on Bass Strait. I have a look over Bass Strait every day when I drive into work. It's it is a creepy place. I think one thing that people don't necessarily understand about it geographically is it's incredibly shallow, 50 meters most of the way.
Really? Is it really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's why it gets so rough. That's why it's such a dangerous passage for ships because, every shift in the ocean's currents and all those sorts of things create really serious waves because it's so shallow. And so there's been, for a very long time, strange stories about this part of the world. And I suppose the other thing about that is that, even on that night, so that night there was sightings from Cape Otway on land and also some fishermen that had taken off from Portland. And those sightings had come in and been spoken about prior to this hitting the news, right? Like, So it's not just corroboration with the radio control tower. It's also people that saw strange things on that night, both in the water and from the Victorian edge of Bass Strait. So, all of those things together. And I mean, it's been thrown up over the years that perhaps because he was a man under financial pressure, he'd owed a lot of money and he'd failed a couple of exams and he was a man under pressure and he had been lying to people about his pilot exams. There's the potential that he could have run away. But I just don't think, as a 20-year-old with no money, and his girlfriend, he was getting ready to propose to her, and his dream was to become a pilot, all that sort of stuff. For him to disappear in that way, I think even in those days, I think it would have taken someone with a bit more nous and certainly a bit more financial backing to make themselves disappear, in any real legitimate sense. And if you were going to disappear, right, if I was going to head off into the sunset and start a new life, what I wouldn't do is make sure that I was headline news for the next 2 weeks by making up a story about UFOs. Like, I mean, that's probably the dumbest way to start that disappearance that you could think of, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, look, I'm in my mid-30s now and I think, with a bit more, life experience and knowledge, certainly wouldn't be thinking that. But even as a 20-year-old, I still would be like, if I was going to disappear, don't leave anything behind. Like, don't,
that's right.
You're disappearing for a reason. Like, abracadabra, goodbye. I'm not going to leave a little breadcrumb trail for people to be like, oh,
That's
where's
right.
she gone? So no, I do agree with that. Like, you wouldn't, and the same thing with the radio. Like, you wouldn't have the conversation. You wouldn't even report any of that. It would just be like, oh, well, this is what it is, and away you go. You would not respond to air traffic control at all, because that's, that they're going to have that as evidence and recording, because naturally that whole thing is going to be investigated. So again, if you were going to go and disappear, you would not do that. So I absolutely agree. And I know that there's, and as you said, that there's Bass Strait obviously has quite a history of sightings, and there's a reference there in terms of the Bass Strait Triangle, which I have heard a few bits and pieces around, but I know I've got a couple of little kind of examples that I sort of stumbled across when looking into this a little bit more. But, it's strange because they're well, now we can say over 100 years old, these particular stories. It's scary to say that. But in 1920, there was two particular cases sort of in the Bass Strait that I haven't done super duper research into, but got a bit of an idea. But there was one called the Elusive Schooner, which was a 90-ton schooner that vanished without a trace whilst travelling through the Bass Strait. And once again, the common theme was there was no wreckage. There wasn't even a distress call. It was just 1 minute there, 1 minute gone. And from what I understand was that at that time, the weather was reasonably calm, which based on what you've said about the Bass Strait is probably a very big rarity. So similar to the Bermuda Triangle in that sense as well, where it's probably a rarity that you've got calmer weather and things are happening. And the second one that happened in the same year, which was only, again, the creepiest part is it's only months after the first one, which is similar to another case we're going to look at, but only months after that particular vessel had gone, which was the Amelia J, there was another vessel called the Southern Cross, which also disappeared in the same region. And once again, the common theme was there was no debris, there was no survivors, no distress calls, there was just nothing. It was like they were there and then they were gone again. And I know we talked about this a little bit before recording, but we did mention it sort of at the start, was with Kaikoura. That only happened a couple of months after Frederick Valentich. So it's interesting to even see that, over 100 years ago, these were vessels on the water that had the same sort of thing happen, only months apart, which is very, very creepy. And the fact that, as you'd made reference to, the Bass Strait is very shallow, very, very rough. So to have the calm weather and suddenly these vessels are disappearing as well, it sort of says something, doesn't it? That there's something going on geometrically. I know I've talked about ley lines before, but I just wonder, is that like an energy? Is it an energy thing? Is that, is it something that in particular parts of the world, I know they've got reference to the Alaskan Triangle, the Bermuda Triangle, the Bass Strait Triangle. Is there some kind of weird anomaly with electromagnetic fields? Because most of these cases will report at some point that there's issues with their compass or their electronics. Even if it's not, 1920, they probably didn't have a big array of tools, but certainly would have had a magnetic compass. Yeah. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Have you got any other cases that you've come across that are similar in this kind of context?
Look, I'm not going to claim it because this is your wonderful research, Heather, but the one that you've got next, the year after, and I find this one fascinating because I think so just to go through it for the listeners. 1921, the Ghost Light Report. So 1921, really important to remember, that this predates modern aircraft capable of doing much at all, really. So we've got multiple fishermen and lighthouse keepers reported bright, fast-moving lights skimming the surface of the water and shooting vertically in the sky. So, the Wright brothers were up to whatever they were doing with planes in 1921, but we are not talking about, fighter jets. This is not, a secret military testing zone. And of course, we're also talking about, 20 years before the whole Adamski flying saucer fad. So this is before UFOs as a concept were even in the public psyche. So there's no frame of reference for people to be seeing these things and describing them that sound very much like modern day UFO reported sightings. So that to me is quite something because, and again, we're talking about fishermen and lighthouse keepers. So these are people that spend all day, every day, their entire lives, staring out at these oceans. That these are not people that are, any sort of weird apparition or anything that could be easily sort of explained as a mirage or something like that. These are people that have spent their entire lives in these places, and they're seeing these, what they refer to as ghost lights, because they haven't got the frame of reference that incorporates UFOs. So that one, I think, that the closeness of the two ships going missing with no wreckage, I think, is a really powerful thing. And then, the ghost light reports, when really, humans did not have at that time anything capable of doing those types of things. Are just, and in such a small space, like Bass Strait, it's really not that big. It is quite extraordinary. So that one, I think, just when I read your research, I was like, wow, that's creepy, but really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I think it's, I know we talked about, again, another case that we referenced that we may kind of slide in there as well. But the interesting thing is that how close they are together and how similar they are together. We talked about a little bit about Rosedale and the closeness to the Rendlesham Forest. Again, it was only several months apart. And the same thing with Frederick Valentich and the Kaikoura Lights, only several months apart. And then looking at the Bass Strait and kind of coming across two ships that had gone missing. And then, as you said, we kind of look at literally 1 year later. And as you said, there's no real point of reference for people of that time to be going, oh, well, it's it's a this, it's a that, because, it was basically non-existent. So to have that happen a year later, and as you said, they're fishermen, they're lighthouse keepers. The only thing they're concerned about is doing their job. They don't.
That's right. Yeah.
They don't have a care in the world for buying into any phenomena, because again, it's probably not something that would have been noted that much. And even if it was, I think about those times and what happened to people that may have reported things like that and were trying to get a message across would end up in places like Beechworth Asylum. So I can't imagine people would want to get it out, Yeah.
That's right. You're dead right. If you're a lighthouse keeper and you're starting to see strange things, people are going to think that you're going stir crazy and you lose your job. So at best, you lose your job, but at worst, absolutely, you end up in Beechworth real quick.
Yeah.
And we all know what happens. You end up, 100 years later on an episode of Beyond the Veil, don't you? Which is not a bad way.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, you don't want to end up there. Not a nice place. But yeah, it is really interesting, just some of these cases, and just it really is. It's only a matter of mere months between different things, or at best a 12-month period. But I don't have the specific monthly dates of these years. So I'm curious if we go back and have a look at them again later. I would, strangely enough, I would not be surprised if it was like the end of 1920 and then the first few months of 1921 that these may have all occurred.
Absolutely,
because it seems to be, again, with Frederick Valentich and with Kaikoura, we're looking at around the October-December period. Rosedale, that was right on the end of September, and Rendlesham was in December of the same year. Like there's something about that time of year. So I know for us in the Southern Hemisphere, we're coming into our summer. So again, it's sort of like, well, is there a reason why we're seeing them at this time of year in the Southern Hemisphere? Is it because we're coming into summer, so we're not going to have as much cloud cover? We're not going to have, not that it really snows much in Australia, but in some spots it does. But we're not going to have like the thickness of snow and stuff like that, that could potentially create another explanation for why we might see things. So, and then when I flick back and look at places like Roswell, that happened in the July of 1947, which in the Northern Hemisphere is summer. So I can't help but wonder, is there something with cases occurring, not saying that they don't happen all year round, but is there something about some of these bigger cases that we notice at different times of year? I don't know if that's something that you've thought of at all, Mark, but
no, not until you said it.
My mind.
But you're dead right. I mean, is it just the fact that we're as humans out and about more often. Are we are we out camping? Are we out in the boat? Are we out doing things at that time of year? Or is there, I mean, it depends entirely on what we think, what it is that's going on in the sky. But, yeah, you're right. UFO flaps are a reported thing. You've mentioned a couple of cases in 1980 already. There was a real focus there. So this is only a couple of years after Valentich, but also in 1980 there's a phenomenal case. You've got Rendlesham in England, and also the Todd Morden one, which is another one that I can't wrap my head around. There was a police officer that chased, Todd Morden, being a little village in the northern part of England, was chasing lights one night. And again, as a police officer, reporting that you're seeing UFOs is not a real great thing. I can't imagine what being a police constable in the north of England in 1980 was like, but I wouldn't have thought that, talking about UFOs would have done you much favours. And that was, of course, only a small while after, in that same town, a man was found after having disappeared for a short period of time on top of a pile of coal, of all things. And he had and he had beard growth that didn't align with the amount of time that he'd been missing, and there was no footprints up to the top of the pile of coal, so they couldn't figure out how he'd got there. He just appeared. This bloke that had gone missing, he was heading off to the village shops or something like that, who was also on a Adamski, I think Ziggy Adamski, not to be confused with the guy that reported the first flying saucers in America decades earlier. But all of these strange things that do, perhaps happen in flaps, and it's really interesting. The summer, I'm going to have a think about that now, Heather. You're going to send me down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's all right.
I do it to myself all the time. And then I sit there and go, why do I do this to myself? You're an idiot. It's because I find it fascinating.
That's right.
But yeah, you're right. And it's interesting, like as you've just mentioned with that particular case, I also can't help but think, it's not, I can't say that it's specific to UAP phenomena, but it also fits this like teleportation style of, manifest or whatever, is Bond Street in Liverpool. And I believe that it's giving that kind of vibe that it's, and I actually can't remember the specific year that actually occurred, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was around the same time, because people had sort of talked about 1 minute they're in this time and the next minute they're in 30 or 40 years earlier, and they're like, wait, where the hell am I? And then somehow they've almost pushed back through this threshold and they're back in their current time. So yeah, that was what popped into my mind as you were talking about that case. With him, he's had this growth and he's turned up somewhere. He doesn't know where he is, and this will probably just show that I'm a parent of young boys at the moment. But there's we all know Toy Story. We all loved the Toy Story growing up, but as a parent, you watch it back and then you think, oh my God, like this is just getting better as I get older. Yeah. But they actually recently made a movie about Buzz Lightyear, and it was supposed to be, we all know in Toy Story 1 where Andy gets the Buzz Lightyear for his birthday, and it's, a big shebang. But they made a movie that was based on how Buzz Lightyear came to be this, whiz-bang thing. Yeah, awesome. And one of the things about it is we hear it in Toy Story where he talks about like hyperspeed and all these different things. And in this movie, I don't know if it's called specifically Buzz Lightyear or if it's just called Lightyear. It's one of the two. And it's very well done, I have to say. But they're on some distant planet and they're trying to figure out how to get to hyperspeed. And one of the things that Buzz does, hence why it's all about him, but he gets in this particular rocket ship thing and he has to go beyond this planet, do some sort of circuit around the orbit, but then to come back, he has to come back through a series of special rings, whatever, to kind of slow him down. And it basically means in a matter of mere minutes, so we'll just say like maybe, 4 minutes or whatever to be able to get to hyperspeed. spoiler, it takes the whole movie to get to hyperspeed. But
Yeah.
when he returns upon the first attempt, he gets back and the technician, we were really worried about you. You're alive, whatever. And he's looking at this guy and he's like, have you always had a beard? And it turns out that it had been like every time he would go and return, it might only be like 4 minutes for him. It's equivalent to like 4 years for the people that are remaining on this planet. So not only did we look at Bond Street just now, but that also kind of jogged in my brain where it was like, oh, maybe there's something to this. There's some weird connection with being in space somehow, and how, minutes for one thing can be years for another. And it's just creepy. But anyway, to go off on a tangent, but I just thought it was interesting to throw in there as well.
But time slip. Missing times, obviously, I can't, and just back on the toys, I can't think about Toy Story anymore. After Toy Story 3, it broke me. Saddest film I've ever seen.
Yeah, so. I know. It's a hard one, isn't it?
It's tough.
We're only a little bit traumatized, but we'll get through it.
That you do. Look, my boys are a bit older now, and you do get there. But the time slip thing, and missing time is obviously a really common, famous thing, starting way back with Betty and Barney Hill from a UFO perspective, and a lot of UFO abduction cases report exactly that. But time slip's fascinating, that the Bond Street one. I think it was something like maybe the 90s back to the 50s or something like that. But I'm not. It could have been the 80s as well. But and there's lots of reports in that same space. But really. Strange things tend to happen with time. That's a very common thing. Now, you could look at that two ways. Either that narrative has caught on in the world and now people sort of view UFO cases as that's what's supposed to happen to me, and something in our brain, whether even if they're not, intentionally trying to deceive, sort of, joins these dots. Or something genuinely does happen with regards to time. But the Todd Morton one and its vicinity to Rendlesham and Rosedale, as you mentioned, again, it's these flaps, which I suppose we've alluded to it about 5 times. So we might jump to Kaikoura, because I think
definitely.
The
Let's
Kaikoura
do it.
case is one that I'd heard the term, but until I did an episode a couple of months ago, I'd not really looked into it. And to be honest, if anything, it's not the most, but it's incredibly compelling evidence for the Valentich case. So we're talking about just, a couple of months later, there was, so Kaikoura and my Kiwi geography and my, I did hear, my Kiwi pronunciation in that episode wasn't particularly good. I spent all of this time looking into the Maori words, trying to get those right, and evidently they were okay, but some of the towns are completely stuffed up. You know how it is. It's really hard.
Yeah, I mispronounce things all the time. I think in my very first episode, I called him David Grush instead of Grush, so it's fine.
So Kaikoura, I'm just going to bring up a map so I've got this at least a little bit right, is off the very north tip. Hang on, where are we? South Island.
So the northern tip of the South Island, is that right?
That's, where are we? Where's Kaikoura?
Sorry for anyone that's listening from New Zealand. We're a bit stupid over here in Australia. We're trying to figure out where things are.
Yes. So, towards the north of the South Island, which is confusing, but a pretty sort of desolate part of coastline. There's not much on that coast. A lot of fishing goes on, not dissimilar, I suppose, from Bass Strait in that regard. And a couple of months later, people had started reporting seeing strange lights in the sky, and they were reporting them from freight planes that were going backwards and forwards from North to South Island. So these stories have been slowly building up. Now, of course, New Zealand's not particularly far away from Australia, and the Frederick Valentich reports had reached the media there too. So this is something that people were familiar with. So all of a sudden, this was, front page news in New Zealand as well. So what happened on, I suppose, what we could call the main evening of these events is that a team of television journalists were going to sit in one of these freight planes and go out one night to capture what they were assuming was just going to be some stock footage. They wanted to do a report on the lights that had been seen a couple of weeks prior. So they went up and they thought, we'll get some stock footage and this will be great and it'll add a bit of eeriness and hopefully the fog will be rolling in over the because the mountains go right down to the ocean, really. But as they went on this flight where they were supposed to be getting this stock footage, of course, they started to get chased by these lights while they had professional video equipment on the plane. And it really was quite a fascinating thing. Again, you've got not just radio operators, but radar operators working out of New Zealand on land, coordinating the calls that are coming in from this freight plane and saying, yeah, look, I can see it and it's moving in strange ways and it's appearing and reappearing and it's enormous. So it was all of these really bizarre things that the control tower operator had never seen. And he was a very experienced, worked for the RAF in England for, a huge amount of years, was, a radar operator with a huge history and had never, ever in his life seen something like this. So you've got journalists on the plane. There was 4 or 5 of them. You've got the 2 pilots. You've got the radar operator. You're in this, and I suppose you could say, well, yeah, everyone's really hyped up about Frederick Valentich. But when you're corroborating what people are seeing with radar images, multiple people, we're not talking about one pilot now. We're talking about a whole group of people based on stories that have been progressing over a matter of weeks. It was just, it's a fascinating tale. And to be honest, I can't believe it's not. It probably is in New Zealand, a bit more famous than it is, but it's not something that you read about or hear about in a lot of the Australian books or TV shows that we've always seen about this sort of stuff. So it was back to that flat, those connections in time that you were talking about too, Heather. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I absolutely agree with you on that. It's probably very well known in New Zealand, and it's not something that, even the Australian cases in Australia really aren't that well known, unless it's like literally around an anniversary or there's something else going on that then highlights it. It's not, I wouldn't call it common knowledge as such, but, even one thing, people probably already know this, but like I watch a lot of Ross Coulthart's reality check podcast on YouTube, and he is, again, people in Australia will know who Ross Coulthart is. He is a very experienced investigative journalist, and he has worked for a lot of the big networks throughout Australia. But Ross is actually from New Zealand, and he was actually late teen. I think he was technically an adult, but he was still sort of in his late teens at the time of Kaikoura, and even he was sort of like at the time, like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean? Like, there's lights. What do you mean this? What do you mean that? And I think, from watching his progression with reality check, he does refer to Kaikoura a few times where it's this. I think it didn't necessarily like spark his interest. I think he'd always been interested from quite some time ago.
We interrupt this broadcast. Your signal has been compromised. Transmission lost.
If you've been listening closely or watching, you might have noticed something strange. Mark's connection didn't just glitch, it dropped out completely. And then the moment that we got him back, mine went dead. It was instant, as if someone had flipped a switch. And my platform has never done that to me before. Not once. And the last time that anything even close to this happened was when I had my interview with Marcus. So, there's been 2 episodes, 2 guests, and 2 conversations about things that didn't like to be named. And then the line breaks in the same pattern. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's just tech. Or maybe something didn't want that part of the conversation getting through. Whatever it was, it left a chill in the room and a question that I just can't shake. When the subject is non-human intelligence, what exactly is listening on the other end? Stay tuned for our part 2 when Mark and I are able to catch up again to finish our discussion. Stay tuned. Bye for now.